Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 55th edition of Data Bites, hosted by Public Digital. I'm Gavin Freegard, and it's wonderful to see so many of you this evening here at Broadway House and online. Let's start in the usual way. Hands up if you've been to Data Bites before. Welcome back. Hands up if this is your first Data Bites. Welcome. Now, last month we celebrated a big anniversary, 6 whole years of Data Bites. Today marks another. It's 10 years to the day since the 2015 general election. Here's one I made 10 years earlier. Now that means that over the weekend there was an even more significant anniversary. Yes, it's 10 years since David Cameron's infamous chaos with Ed Miliband tweet. 417 days after posting that, Cameron resigned as Prime Minister following the Brexit vote. 3,115 days, 8.5 years after that, Cameron returned to government as Foreign Secretary under the 5th Tory Prime Minister in that time period. Just think of the chaos we avoided. And a mere 3,715 days after that tweet, we finally got chaos with Ed Miliband. Perhaps the former PM should have heeded his own advice. Let's start with some housekeeping. We are on the record and are being live streamed, obviously. If you're on social media, Twitter or otherwise, the hashtag is PDDataBites. And you can put your questions to our speakers via Slido, bit.ly/databytes55, all lowercase. If you're here in the room, you can, of course, raise your hands as well. What does Data Bites do? Well, we aim to put good work involving data, especially in the public sector, on the record so we can all learn from it, provide a space for the different data communities in and around government to come together and bring to life what better data can do for all of us, whether we think of ourselves as data people or not. How does Data Bites work? This evening, you're going to be treated to 4 presentations on interesting data projects. Each of our speakers will have 8 minutes to present. Yes, just 8 minutes. There are 8 bits in a byte, hence 8 minutes in a data byte. Each speaker will then take questions for 8 minutes. Yes, just 8 minutes. And then we move on to the next speaker. So 4 presentations of 8 minutes, each followed by questions for 8 minutes. You can watch the previous 5 Data Bites at Public Digital, including last month's, at bit.ly/PDDataBites, all lowercase. The 49 before that were hosted by the Institute for Government. You can watch those at bit.ly/IFGDataBites, capital IFGDB. They include a few of tonight's speakers: Tom on screen at DataBites 36 in December 2022, Ed at DataBites 28 in April 2022, and Laura during the pandemic when we were still online. So what's happened in government and politics since we last met? Well, lots of elections. We had the first by-election of this Parliament. You can see it at the bottom there, and you can see that Runcorn and Helsby turned from Labour red to Reform turquoise. Reform overturned a fairly hefty Labour majority to take the seat by just 6 votes, the smallest winning margin in a by-election ever, and the only by-election in the 20 closest constituency contests in any Westminster election since 1945. Reform also performed strongly in the English local elections as they bagged a couple of new mayoralties and went from 0 councillors when these councils were last contested to nearly 700 now. Good nights too for the Lib Dems and the Greens, less so for Labour, and nearly 700 seats lost for the Tories. To give you a sense of how unusual those results were, this chart shows how many seats changed hands at each local election from 1975 to 2024. Who won them is above the axis and who lost them is below. But look at just how many seats changed this time round. And that huge reform surge, or reformation, as some have dubbed it. Now, if you want more evidence of our party politics getting feisty and fragmented, there was a poll published yesterday ahead of the Welsh Senedd elections in May 2026. Now, long-time Data Bites devotees, I'm told some of you do exist, will know that I'm Welsh. It usually becomes obvious around the Six Nations when I have lots of charts about glorious rugby victories, which I resisted this year for some unknown reason. Now, Labour has won every election in Wales since 1922. Yesterday's poll suggests that record is under real threat, with Plaid first and Reform second. Now, those results would cause chaos in Welsh politics, and we all know who to blame for that. Now, there's a similar poll for Scotland today with the SNP first and Reform second, but we move from Reformation to Rome for the next election. And after the death of Pope Francis, the conclave to choose the next pope starts today, with the first votes expected tomorrow. And of course, we all know one person who would fancy their chances in an open papal election. Now, Trump's not had the best month, getting knocked out of the World Snooker Championship. But Judd's presidential namesake celebrated the first 100 days of his presidential term. Now, we can see the impact he's had on the stock market. We can see his presidential approval ratings. But it's not all been bad for the Donald. Any idea what these highlighted days represent?
Golf. Number one tweets.
Golf. Was indeed golf. They're all the days where Trump has played golf, 24 out of 100, or whatever that is as a percentage. And let's not forget Trump's electoral successes in driving voters to left or liberal parties. Now, last month we looked at the Canadian polling before Trump's inauguration and after, and with the actual election results delivering a victory for Mark Carney's Liberals in red. We can look at Australia too, where the Labour government in red was in polling trouble. It started to recover and then won the election. Now, interestingly, in both Canada and Australia, the opposition leader lost their own seat, something Kemi Badenoch might also want to think about. But perhaps we're wrongly attributing Liberal Party's election successes to Trump, because if we zoom in, we can see the discussion of a coalition of chaos. I think we all know who the real culprit is. That's more than enough of that. Let's turn to tonight's speakers. Our first speaker is Laura Gilbert, now at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, but previously Cabinet Office, 10DS and I.AI, on transforming the public sector with data and AI. Our second speaker is Ed Humphreys from the Office for Statistics Regulation on Beyond Mechanistic Thinking. Third up is Alex Blanford of the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Oxford, and also Public Digital on You Can't API Your Way Out of Politics, Civic Tech, Open Data and the Next 10 Years. And our fourth and final speaker is Tom Smith from MHCLG, or Mahoka Logo, if you prefer, on their AI Directorate, Local Digital and Local AI. The next Data Bites will be our first outside of London. We're heading to Liverpool on Wednesday, the 4th of June. We're all very excited about it. Thank you. If you like puns about Liverpool geography, don't worry, I have a ton of others. So many, you'll be begging for Mersey. We'll be back in London for Wednesday, the 2nd of July, if my PD colleagues haven't killed me by then. If you work for a public sector organisation and would like to speak or know someone who should, come and speak to me afterwards, or email events@public.digital. And if you enjoy Data Bites and would like to help us out, please tell a friend, especially if they work in the public sector, or share something you found interesting tonight on social media. There'll be video, audio and slides available for you to share in the next few days. That's more than enough from me. My pleasure to hand over to our first speaker this evening, and that's Laura. Laura.
Testing, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed for having me. Let's just see if we can click this forward.
I think the slides are just loading.
There we go. Yes, I mean, feel free to not start the timer as well, because this is unlikely to go well timing-wise. I didn't realise quite how well thought out everything was here. Really lovely to see you all. I am not going to be showing loads and loads of data because I'm obsessed with other things at the moment. I originally was a particle physicist. I then went in briefly into quantitative finance, very different sort of data. You're starting off with very specific things you're trying to prove absolutely, and moving to a massive needle in a haystack that's incredibly swayed by human behaviour. After that, I went and ran a medtech company, built lots of algorithms to try and measure biological systems, different type of data again. And after we sold that company, I didn't know what to do, and I had a few glasses of wine, so I applied for a job in Downing Street, as you do. And I was very, very surprised to get the job. And so I went in September 2020, and I sat down with the principal private secretary, and he said, welcome. And I said, thanks very much. And he said, I've got one piece of advice for you. And I said, brilliant, what is it? And he said, you've got 6 months to have an impact. And I said, gosh, what would you like me to do? And he said, I don't know. And what had been happening, of course, in government was that over the previous 6 months, it became apparent that having really good data was a very good way to manage something like a pandemic. A lot of work had gone into opening up data sets, and we were suddenly in a position where the Prime Minister and other ministers had a flow of data and information, and they thought it would be a good idea to try and get that about everything else. And so I went in, but into a building that wasn't expecting quite what we were going to do. And what I thought would happen is I'd go in and I'd go, gosh, you're doing educational policy, we've got some amazing data, we've got some predictive models, we can really help you make great policy decisions, and would you like to see it? And they said, no, go away. Not all of them. There were some people that were really keen. And I quickly started to learn that I'd had quite a narrow view of data and what it was and what we did with it. Despite having a background of using lots of different types of data in different ways, I hadn't thought about what was most important, which is, I think in many ways, for a lot of us, data information about how people work and how you should talk to them when you want to present your data. And that's something I'm very interested in. So I stopped looking entirely at the data and the sort of mechanisms, and I started thinking about how we were going to actually change the system, and it came down to people. This is one of the greatest studies of all time. If you've not seen it before, I'm about to change your life. The Tetlock study. In 1985, he kicked this study off, and he had 284 political experts. So they were people that knew a lot about policy. And he asked them 100 questions, and those questions were sort of quite general, really, but they were about predicting the future. So the idea would be this area of policy, in 20 years' time, what's going to happen? Quite simple. This thing that's happening at the moment, in 20 years' time, will there be more of it, less of it, or sort of roughly as it is now? 100 questions, and all these 284 people, they sat down, they wrote down their predictions, and he waited patiently 20 years, and he analysed the results, and he wrote a paper on it, and Daniel Kahneman read that paper, and he responded, he commented, he said, the experts have done about as well as monkeys throwing darts to the dartboard. Really badly. They've done slightly better than complete random chance. They've done much worse than what was euphemistically referred to as a minimally sophisticated statistical model, which meant just draw a line through it, like straight line. And they were phenomenally confident that they will have been proved right. So they all very much believed that their predictions would come true. So what we see there is a picture of people, policy experts specifically, who believe that they know what's going to happen next and what the future looks like, and are wrong. And it turns out that's true of all of us. Even quite near-term technology predictions are wrong from experts 80% of the time. And in fact, it's not statistically significant, but people did slightly better at predicting the future in fields they weren't the expert in. So every time somebody comes up to me and says, what's next for AI? I say, there is no point asking me. I probably know less well than the greengrocer based on statistics alone. So there we went, and I started to adjust the way I talked to people and looked up a lot of data and evidence and research and information about how can you get people and how can you present information, how can you talk to people that will put them in a state of mind where they are able to and want to listen to your information, where they feel ownership over the information, where they are able to change their minds. And that was the thing that I learned about data that I probably didn't know before this job. However, I'm moving on from that to AI because that is what I really love doing, and that's my job at the moment. So obviously we've been building up the data science team. We went from all of the data coming on Excel spreadsheets to about 8,000 live data feeds coming in, ready to process, lots of predictive models, live dashboards, very exciting. And then ChatGPT hit. And none of us, shockingly, predicted that. So we weren't ready. There's technology predictions. You know, we're not very good at it even when we work in the field. So we had to figure out what to do. And that was a huge opportunity, and it put us in a space where we could suddenly, we're the cool kids, we're doing all the algorithms and stuff, start getting invited to the parties. So the ministers, you know, the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister said, well, what can you do? And I said, well, I can bring in loads of technology experts and build things that will change the world. So we set up the Incubator for Artificial Intelligence, and if you like government, and if you like information and the way that we can change lives, go and look this up. It's on ai.gov.uk. They're radically transparent. They publish code, they publish blogs, they'll show pictures of everything they're doing, and they're really trying to change government. The mission of this is to make government more human with AI. So again, we're in a space where there's data and technology, but actually what we're really interested in is people. And a use case where you are either getting a teacher closer to students because they don't need to get their admin, or a use case where you're detecting people who write in that might be, for example, suicidal, and then somebody phones them when they need help immediately instead of waiting a year to get back to them. These are the sorts of use cases that we can use in government to make the experience of government much more human. I'm going to show you one little video of something the team built, which will hopefully play quietly in the background. If there's any sound, kill it. This is called Caddy, hopefully. You can download it, the code's online, and what it does is it tries to help people help others. We designed it with Citizens Advice. It sits next to the Citizens Advice advisor. They have a very difficult job. They have to know all the law, all of the regulations, everything you can do in order to help somebody that comes in need. And Caddy has all of that information, and it's integrated into your Teams or your Slack or your Google Meet, and you can talk to it like a colleague at Caddy. My client has been evicted, what can they do about it? And it will come back to you with a response. A supervisor can check the response, and it does a really good job. It doesn't hallucinate, it's engineered really carefully. And as a result of that, the advisors said that they felt 2.5 times more confident that they were doing their jobs well and they were helping people. And there was a 60% improvement in the turnaround successfully of cases being resolved. So little things like that actually don't take a lot of work. They didn't take a very long time to deploy. Working with the people that want to help people. We can use AI to do brilliant things. I'm looking at the time, so I'm not going to do my last couple of slides, and instead I'll talk to you, Gavin, if that's all right.
We've got
10 seconds. We're now doing this in the Tony Blair Institute for the entire world. It's much better, it's much bigger, and we're going to try and design systems that prevent problems before they happen for governments around the world. I can't tell you loads about it, but it will be going live fairly soon. Watch this space. Little advertising piece.
Thank you, Laura.
8 minutes is short.
Worryingly so. We'll come to you for questions in a second. Please tell us who you are if you can. Remember, we are on the record. Please wait for the microphone, and please do keep your questions short because, as Laura says, 8 minutes is very short, and we will start the timer with the first question. If you're watching us online or you're in the room and don't want to put your hand up, the link is bit.ly/databytes55, all lowercase, and that will take you to Slido where you can ask a question. But let's start in the room. Who would like to go first? First question to Laura. And we've got one just there. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, Laura. Great presentation. And when I talk to civil servants, a lot of them talk about the fact that you said those pieces of work weren't very big. A lot of them, when you'd done the skin, in my experience previously as a civil servant, was that the work was maybe 1/20th to 1/50th of the amount of effort required to get any of those projects live. Because in my experience, some of the governance, or working your way through data protection, or working your way through funding and treasury and approvals. So I was curious if you had any thoughts on how or what the governments need to do around the world to deploy this stuff at scale, to get faster, to go bigger?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you'll notice that the sort of one example I've put up that we managed to deliver quite quickly was with Citizens Advice rather than with government. It is very difficult to do things internally. I think that my challenge to governments when they say that, which they do a lot, is that there is so much low-hanging fruit. You can find something you can deliver. We had literally thousands of ideas coming through for things that you could fix with a new algorithm, systems that are broken that you could go in and do. And the first thing we did was assess them for deliverability. And if we're in a system where we think they're not going to have the right data, that we can't get our hands on, there's going to be massive blockers, or critically, we can't get to the person you need to do the user testing. You can't get to the end user. You can't get to the team working with it. It's going to be blocked in delivery. We just didn't do it. And that's not a great permanent solution, but we're in a space now where we should be picking all of these and learning from doing it and getting people more comfortable with things like data protection. A lot of government response now tends to be, oh no, I'm in charge of keeping this data safe. And we need to train people to be, I'm in charge of deriving value from this data. My job is to ensure that we keep people, we deliver a good service. And I liken the data protection, we have all this information about people, and of course it has to be safe. But if you were a doctor and you had on file all of the information about a human body that told you that person had cancer and that they could die and they need treatment, and you didn't look at it and you didn't do anything about it, you'd be ethically liable for the suffering that they go through. I do feel quite strongly that we, as in the government space, need to take accountability for the fact that we have information about people that can significantly help them. And if we don't put the work in and don't do it, that's actually an ethical failing on our part as well. So great question, and I feel very strongly about the data sharing. For me, we're just trying to lead by example and pick things that work and hope that we can show people that you can do this. And if citizens' advice can do it, so can government.
Thanks. Following quite nicely from that, I'm going to go to an online question. This is from Anonymous. Good evening to you, Anonymous. They say, fascinating. Can you say how you're using AI personally in your day-to-day work? Yes.
So can I mention products? Yeah, big fan of Claude. Claude is very pro-social and does a great job of making you feel good about yourself. If you ever need a little boost, give it your CV. Give it a job that you'd really like, and it will tell you the ways in which you're definitely going to get that job. You're incredibly well suited, and also the things to highlight. I use Claude and AI systems for a lot now, generating slide packs, generating images, generating logos when we need to do that, branding, etc. Lots of summarization, lots of outlining. When you've got to write a paper and you just need to get started, you can ask it to suggest a structure, and then I've got something to work for. So that kind of speeding up piece, and definitely summarising the many, many 100-page documents I get on governance, so that you can then go on a panel and people say, tell us what you thought of the European AI Act. And you go, oh yes, having read that in detail. It's great, love it.
Excellent. Let's come back into the room for the next question. We've got a hand up just there.
Thank you. Alex Blandford, Public Digital. I'm really interested in the, you're talking about their kind of AI being used to create very interventionist things from the state. But at the same time, you were describing the use cases of it, which were essentially compensating for a retreating state. So how much do you feel that the current setup with AI is very politically contingent on the state that the country finds itself in right now? And how do you feel that the work could continue or should continue, or how risky do you think it is that it keeps going to compensate for the fact that we have fewer frontline staff and that and a sort of small addendum thing? Do you feel that people are going to notice when they get AI nudges, or that it will feel so obvious that even putting a human face on it might again feel like you're being just part of a machine process?
Well, I think there's a framing angle on that. So when I go to my bank and I get the AI chatbot and I say, yeah, I want to talk about my mortgage, and it goes, do you want to talk about your mortgage? And I say, yes, like I've already told you that. I want this. And it says, please select from the following options. That's horrible AI. And I feel abused by having to interact with that and not a person. However, when I come to a chatbot that genuinely does exactly what I wanted to incredibly quickly, quite relieved I don't have to talk to a person. And I think probably a lot of people in that boat where if it's really good and it's really efficient and there's transparency that it's happening, then I don't think people mind. And I don't think that you're in a case where citizens advise customers would say, no, advisor, you must repeat from memory the government regulations on this, rather than let me just ask the machine and it will come back. It's like a very, very advanced search. So I don't think we're doing people out as far as that goes. When it comes to the government space, government is very, very inefficient. There are a lot of roles that are in place because the system is broken. Yes, we should replace them. We do have a duty of care to people's taxes, if nothing else. And the fact that we are, in some cases, building very large teams to compensate for the fact there isn't a digital system, there isn't efficient flow of information, and that you have to put humans in place just to work around systems, I don't think that's a good service for people. And more than that, we do have a retreating state. In some places, we're in a degree of crisis. And if we cannot get this right now, how do you fund the NHS going forward with an ageing population? You can't we have to do this. It's like a crisis to the level of COVID, but much slower. So I don't see it as a risk. I see it as something we absolutely must manage, or we will have to fundamentally change the way we do public services, where we, have maybe a much more American system, and a lot of those services don't get fulfilled. And that's not where I want to go with it. So I'm pro AI, and I know that that there are some things I hate. The idea that people target adverts to me much more effectively, I really dislike. But I think this is a requirement, and I think that it's our job to try and grab it and do the very best we can to make it work for humans in a pro-social way that transparently helps them and doesn't harm anyone. So yeah, go forth and build.
Thanks. The most popular question online comes from Nikki Zaccario. Evening to you, Nikki. Hi, Laura. What were the top 3 blockers you faced in government? And are these different to what you're facing internationally at the Tony Blair Institute?
Well, Tony Blair Institute advises governments and specifically prime ministers, so it's not completely dissimilar, except that you're always going in the top of the rung, which does make things a little bit easier. Top 3 blockers. Well, skills is one of them. We talk about this a lot. It's difficult to find kind of technical people that can help you in departments, and very often it's hard to do without them. So, we for a long time had one live data feed, which was just a screenshot of a table on a weekly basis, and that kind of thing can really sort of slow you down. There are real perverse incentives in the system, and I think those are the hardest part. So in order to find people that are going to help you deliver something, help you deploy something, help you change the system, you need to find people who will do that regardless of it not being in their personal best interest to do so. And that's some people, but not a lot. And bluntly, the further you go up through the civil service system, the more you tend to have a very homogenous set of people who really believe that civil service is about generalism, it's about talking, it's about controlling flows of information, and it's about power. And when you go and say, well, it should be about delivery, performance, getting things done, it's not in the best interest to help you to do that quite a lot of the time, and that's a very significant blocker. And then otherwise, it's just an old system. And I think you do get in a state where people confidently assert that this is not possible. And if you're prepared to listen to them, you don't get very far very quickly. But fortunately, I wasn't, so just went and did it anyway. But not everyone, in fact, the vast majority of people are not in a position, such as Downing Street, where you're able to do that. So as a broader sense, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in the civil service, thinks it's not able to do things, and therefore it doesn't.
Great. I wish we had more time because there are lots of brilliant questions coming in, but we are hoisted by our 8-minute petard. Laura, thank you very much
Thank you
indeed.
very much.
And our second speaker tonight is Ed. Welcome back, Ed.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here. This has been a very busy time for us in the Office for Statistics Regulation, and there's a lot I could talk about. I could talk about our finding that on economic statistics, ONS needs to restore confidence urgently, and these are some extracts from the declining response rates that we report in that. Not going to talk about that. I could report our recent finding that a DWP media release was entirely misleading, which is the punchiest phrase I think we've ever used. I'm not going to talk about that. And I could talk about AI, but I'm not going to, although I slightly regret it because the reason I'm not going to do it is I know nothing about it. And I now realise that qualifies me to be as expert as a greengrocer. But I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to talk about is a longer-term issue that underpins the work that we do in the Office for Statistics Regulation. Now, when I thought about DataBytes, when Gavin asked me to do this, I thought, well, DataBytes is really about innovation. It's really about the conditions and the enablers of innovation. And I thought, well, where is it that we see innovation being inhibited, and where do we see it thriving? So I'm going to talk about this barrier to innovation being the incurious belief that data are fixed objects produced by predictable mechanistic systems. And I'm going to give 3 examples of how innovation comes from just driving a truck through that incurious belief. It's a past example, a present example, and a future example. The past example is Scotland's census. Some of you will know this story. England and Wales did a census, and Northern Ireland did a census in 2021. Great response rate, about 97%. Scotland, less good response rate, got up to 89.8%, but they started about 84. Now, if you think that the census is about a count of how many people fill in a form, even 89.8% is a disaster. The incurious view would be to say, well, we've got 89.8%, we're a bit stuck. If you have an innovation mindset, you say, well, what can we do which can help us? And what National Records Scotland did is that they drew on administrative data to impute, to enrich, and to quality control the census response. And we've just published a really nice piece on how they did that and then how they explained the uncertainty. They did it by getting beyond this incurious belief that they were just stuck with their numbers. The present example, this is the DFT Stats 19 release, all road users killed in traffic collisions in Great Britain. Long run decline, but over the last 10 years, you see very clearly stagnation, that the rate has dropped. If you have an incurious belief, you'd say, well, those are the numbers, that's maybe the natural floor to how many people we can expect to see killed on the roads. The curious mindset is to say, well, we're not stuck with those data. There's a lot of other data. And in fact, Stats 19 just records what happens at the road. It doesn't capture injury prevention. It doesn't capture what happens pre-hospital care in the ambulance. It doesn't capture the immediate hospital care or extended or rehab or disability or recovery. And some brilliant work from Imperial College, Seema Yalamanchili, has started to put together a linked data set which does all that with the not very meaningful title, Pre-Hospital Research and Audit Network. But it's a linked data set, and it's quite clear from the early work that what it's going to do is it's going to start to identify the interventions that you can make at various points here to mean that that graph of fatalities in road traffic collisions can fall further. So not being stuck with the incurious belief that we've got the numbers, that's all we've got, thinking about how to get beyond them. Great example of innovation. And my future example of innovation is around health inequalities. Many of you will know the UK government has a health mission, and it has a milestone in its plan for change for this health mission, which is this based on this chart. This chart is the percentage of patients waiting less than 18 weeks on the elective waiting list. And the milestone is to get that up to 92%, so to get it back up to here, where it was in about the middle of the last decade. So those are the data to hand. The incurious approach is to say, well, let's think about the various interventions we can make to do that. In the future, I'd like people to go quite beyond that and think much more broadly and say, actually, what we really need to think about is health inequalities. We need to think upstream of what happens in a hospital, what is making people turn up for elective treatment, and think, what are the causes, factors, and where can we intervene? To do what was done on road traffic collisions, but at the meta level of health. This is a chart from a fantastic resource called I forgot what it's called, Fingerprints, which is Fingertips, which is the Office for Health Improvement and Disparity, and they provide lots of health inequality data. I generated this chart. I think it's absolutely staggering. It's the prevalence of obesity in reception-aged children by deprivation decile. And you see here quite clearly that something happened, I'll answers on a postcard what it might have been, in 2021, which meant that school-aged children, 4 or 5, were turning up at school spectacularly more obese than they were in previous years or afterwards. Now, that's the kind of analysis which I think would be saying, well, we might be storing up a bit of a public health problem here, and that might then ramify on into those kind of milestone waiting time targets in due course. This is just one example, but it led us to say, this quote you've got here on the left, you can discover the fundamentals of the population's health without ever going near a hospital league performance table. So that's the future example. I'm not yet seeing that, but I'd love to see it. So what underpins all of this? Focus on thinking beyond data silos at hand and identifying alternative data sources. This is a call to action. thinking about data as being dynamic, organic, not just this fixed product of fixed systems. And just maybe, those insights are even more relevant now in the age of AI than they ever have been before. Just to close, just to say, you can find all of this on our website. There's some links here. These are the screenshots from the various examples that I've talked through. Very happy, and I've come in rather spoke too quickly. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. A reminder for those of you online, I'm sure you're already on the Slido, but it's bit.ly/databytes55, all lowercase if you're not, and if you're in the room, you can use that to ask questions, as well as raising your hand, which is what I'm going to ask you to do now. Who would like to ask the first question of Ed? We've got one down the front, and I'll come to you next.
Thanks. Tom Smith from MHCLG. Ed, really enjoyed that. Drawing on Laura's kind of challenges, what would you and how would you improve that kind of work in government? What do we need to do more of to do more of that?
Well, I think the first point is it's going to sound a little bit soft and loose, but I think it is the mindset of the curiosity to go beyond. I see a lot in analysis and in policy, a tendency to fixate on the data at hand and to kind of think of data as emerging from a fixed system that is pretty linear. And what this is all about is saying, yeah, actually to make progress, you need to think much more broadly and identify the other sources. So the first thing is that sort of, to use maybe an overused term, curiosity. I also think, though, that there's a very significant barrier of the things I'm talking about are essentially linkage exercises. Within government, this tendency to think of linkage as being a risky thing to do because you might get into trouble with public criticism. And my view there is the only solution to that is really extensive public engagement, partly because it helps provide a kind of a transparency for the public, but also, I think more importantly, it would give confidence to the governance parts of government entities that actually this is not as risky as you think it is. So I think that would be the other thing to do. So a curious mindset and to really crack this data governance problem through a really extensive emphasis on public engagement.
Great, thanks, Ed. Just there, yeah. In the excellent "Make Things Open, It Makes Things Better" t-shirt.
Thank you very much. David Durant, again, following on from what Laura was saying, when you're taking data to very senior people who don't want to hear it, or particularly when it's conflicting with a policy point of view that they've got, how do you have that conversation and try to bring them on board with the work that you're doing?
And just to say as well, Tom King online has a question which is very much on a similar theme. What advice do you have for people butting up against fixed mindsets and power-driven generalists who know there is only one way?
Well, I would say that what I've tried to do in this set of slides is something I don't normally do. Normally a presentation from me is quite, and those of you who've been victims of my presentations will know, quite wordy, quite conceptual. And what I try to do is make it a bit more visual and tell the stories through visual charts. I think that visualization is an incredibly powerful way of sort of getting into the door. That I think there is a mindset in those sort of power-driven journalists that they like to dress up in the clothes of data and analysis because it kind of makes them feel a bit like with it and a bit like, you know, a bit down with the kids. And I think you can probably play to that a little bit by using visualizations. On Tom's question, I'm afraid I'll go back to one of my mantras, which is that the more open you can be with data, the more you're going to carry people with you. And I think hammering that story home to those power-driven journalists is the only way, and it's probably a long run game. I think you need to wear them down.
Thanks. Let's come back into the room for the next question. We've got one just there.
Hi, more NHS England. 10 years ago, we had a lot more open data to do all this lovely linkage. So how do you think we can encourage people to open data, like you said? Because I feel it's like been really much in decline, and all of this beautiful linkage that we want to do in NHS England is really hard because we can't reach sometimes this data. And the National Data Library, I don't know what it is yet or when it will happen. So how should we go forward with this then?
I had a meeting with somebody very senior in DCIT fairly recently, and I said, can you tell me what's happening with the National Data Library? And this person said, I was rather hoping you'd tell me. So I don't think anybody really, I don't think you're alone in not knowing. I think the story in NHS England actually illustrates my two general points to Tom earlier. I think that story of 10 years is one of, firstly, this ever greater focusing in on the metrics of the performance of the NHS as a system, kind of operational metrics, then becoming sort of reified and dashboardized, and all of the great stuff that you provide more broadly just being seen as sort of like a second order thing. And secondly, the data governance, like industry, I think, taking over. And I think, again, my advice is, on the first, is to just repeatedly drive home the point that, if you're just focusing on the system metrics, you're always going to be somewhat downstream of where the problems are really emerging. And I think there will be analysis that you can do to demonstrate that. And I think on the second point, the data governance point, I think people always talk about the need for leadership. There is not a leader in the civil service who does not say they're in favour of more data linkage. The problem comes lower down when people who are charged with data governance have a risk aversion, which I fully understand, and I think the only way through that is the evidence from public engagement.
Following on nicely from some of that, Anonymous Online asks, how do we encourage a change in culture in the way that politicians set numerical targets for different outcomes?
Oh, that's a really nice question. I give a different kind of presentation where I talk about the misuse of data in the public domain, and I talk about this tendency to weaponize data. It's a very convenient sort of political communication tool to have the number that you pound away at, you repeat, and that then embeds itself into targets. And I'm afraid that's where the second part of OSR's identity comes in, which is where we really strongly argue in favour of what we call intelligent transparency, which is about if you're using numbers, you've got to explain the context, you've got to explain where they're from, and you've got to respect the caveats and limitations which surround them. And we do that without fear or favour. We do it a lot. I think we're having progress with it. I think that's our mission, right? That's our mission, is to pound away at that. Just as much as numbers are weaponised, we've got to weaponise back intelligent transparency, and that's what we try and do.
Great, thank you. We've got time for a quick question in the room. Quick final hand.
Well, can I just use a bit of time just to say, like, when I'm preparing for a talk, I often do this thing where I, empty my mind, and I do it by working out an anagram of some word that I can see. And data bytes is an anagram of best at aid. There you go.
Wow. That's a perfect note on which to end that particular segment. Ed, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, just before I introduce the fantastic Alex, Dave, we've got a question online from Nikki, which is, where can they get a T-shirt like yours?
I'll find out and let you know.
Excellent. Dave will find out and let us know. Thank you. Our third speaker tonight is Alex.
I should say I messaged Gavin and said, would it be too much to do it in a gown? And he said, no, that would be amazing in all caps. So my cost per wear is going down. Hello, I'm Alex Blanford. I'm coming to you to talk about why you can't API your way out of politics. It doesn't sound like it's going to fit in with the others, but it really does. I'm here with two hats, as ever, regular viewers will know. Public Digital, who run this lovely event. I'm a principal consultant, Oxford University. I'm a DPhil student. I'm a part-time DPhil student. Do not be a part-time DPhil student while you try and work for Public Digital, or indeed any other public sector organisation. It's a very silly idea. 7 years in, at some point, this will be submitted. I am an anthropologist, so we're talking about data. We're talking about data that came from me sitting around and drinking beer and eating dinner with people. So it's data, but it's not really the way we usually talk about data here. So just bear that in mind. I work with radicalized nerds. They had a process. I work with civic technology organizations. You'll have heard of them. My Society, who presented a couple of weeks ago. Democracy Club, who run polling station finders for the Electoral Commission, because in the grand tradition of things like Hansard, you build something on the outside and gradually it becomes nationalized by the back door. And people like Full Fact, who have also presented recently. They've all been radicalized by things not being good enough and then thinking, well, I should really have a go at fixing that, which is a great sentiment. And so I want to talk to you about the stack. Sometimes you'll see it sort of like this. You'll have had some expensive data consultant come in and talk to you about this, that you have data at the bottom, information, knowledge, wisdom. It works slightly differently in the civic tech space. So you have a messy mixture of just crap at the bottom. You have some thankless bunch who are spending their lives, their evenings, their weekends, moulding that into something vaguely usable. And then, from doing that, government will suddenly be better. And we've really struggled with the question mark. How do you turn lots of civic enthusiasm, lots of people who really want to get involved, into a bunch of people who actually change the system and make it so that, as we were just talking about, how do you get beyond one set of numbers that are a target? How do you get beyond dashboarditis? It's difficult. I've asterisked that. I think the closest is actually Full Fact, because they're the only ones who really come to an argumentation layer. They take data and they go, this says this thing, and they say it even if it's inconvenient for a politician. Because there's a problem if you publish data and then you spend your time going, well, actually, this shows that these politicians are liars, or that this political thing that I like is proved by these numbers. It decreases the kind of apoliticalness of the data that you publish, or at least the contention is that it does. So you have civic tech organizations that do try and sit in this space. But with the greatest of respect to friends in Full Fact, I don't think they fixed the internet's misinformation problem in fact, it has got worse on their watch, and I lay this charge at Andy Duffield's feet and Meavan and all the rest of them. Anyway, not their fault. Bless them for trying. And I think as well, people from within civic technology end up in government. How many people in early government digital service spaces came from these? Most of them. And it tricks you. It tricks you into thinking that you are next to the Prime Minister. You go for a meeting in number 10, you pat Larry, and you go, I've made it. I'm making decisions. You might notice a younger man in the background there. I was, not the Duke behind. I was young once, and I sat in Parliament thinking, I'm making decisions. This matters, and it doesn't. That's what tricks you, is that, I don't know if anyone did A-level politics, but you might remember it's A-level government and politics. The two things are quite separate. So one of my big sort of pieces that I look at in my research is the journey from 2010 to now. And those of us of this vintage that still had a bit more hair might remember armchair auditors. They were Eric Pickles' army of civic tech nerds who were going to go through all of this data and say, here is where the waste is. Here is where the government is falling to pieces. So let's just, 8th of July 2011, 9th of November 2012, it had already stopped working as far as BBC News was concerned. In fact, even by 2015, friend of Open Government Ben Worthy was able to write an article going, this didn't work on quite a few levels. And one of the things he kind of points out, and that if you stop and think about it for a few minutes, is that the incentives were misaligned. We have a bunch of civic technologists working on how do we change the system? How do we make government open? How do we make government transparent? And how do we do things? And perhaps how do we create data sets without a purpose that might just be useful in the future? And on the other side, you have how do we cut the state back to its core through austerity, you had a political project. And those two things were orthogonal to each other. They had very much misaligned incentives. I will also kind of, for those of us with a long memory, 2011, 2012, most of the sort of civic tech things that you could go to have a free beer and play around with some government data were usually sponsored by the Taxpayers Alliance, which also perhaps brings a little bit of a show of what the political incentives for people funding this were. And so my thing from the last 15 years is open data doesn't change politics. We've done open data. It's been rolled back. It hasn't changed. It didn't change how the Conservatives thought about it. It didn't change how the Lib Dems thought about it. It is not changing how Labour thinks about it. We've had some successes, but they've come in the service of other policy goals. They are not in and of them. This is not in and of itself. Open data, open government is not in and of itself a policy position that any of the major parties sign up to, support, salute on a flagpole. They're political positions, big P political. They're not. This isn't technocratic reform. And the mistake civic technologists have made over the last 15 years is imagining that this can just be kind of just shuffled in, that we can just do we can do a GDS over here, we can have an arm's length open data institute over here, and that will change the tenor of how British government deals with data in the public space. And it won't, and it hasn't. So, for the next 10 years, this is my manifesto for what you should be doing. Start a civic tech project. We haven't had any good new ones for about 10 years now, and that's obviously because the good ones are all taken, but have a go. If you think of something that you haven't, that's really annoying you, and you speak to another data friend you have around this room is a very good place, and two of you agree, start something. It might work. Work in an NGO, because eventually all civic tech projects become an NGO, so you may as well just sort of cut out the middleman and go and work straight for one that's going to deal with data. But lastly, with my last 10 seconds, join a political party. I don't really mind which one at this stage, your preference, but the only way that open data and open government are going to be part of some manifesto in 10 years' time, or 5 years' time if we're very lucky, is if they believe in it and they see the benefits of it, and that convincing point did not come from a civil servant or a civic activist from the outside. Anyway, if you want to shout at me about my academic opinions, that's me. If you want to shout about me about my work opinions, that's me. And for everything else, blue sky down there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. I feel like there might be a T-shirt with radicalised nerds appearing in the near future. You can wear that one next time. A reminder that it's bit.ly/databytes55, all lowercase, if you want to submit questions via Slido. But let's start in the room. And we've got a hand up already just there at the back.
Evening, Alex. Dan Klein. Excellent. I'm going to do a shout out. There is a CivTech, by the way, new one out there, New Automotive. Please go look for those of you that don't. Doing some great work with electric vehicle uptake.
Cool.
I just wanted to go back to your slide where you talked about information and data. Is there a need, do you think, and I'm just conscious of your thoughts on this now, around asking the senior members of the civil service what information they would like? So if I think of old GDS stuff, what's the need from an information perspective? What do they need to make decisions? And then take that through to data. Thoughts?
I think one of the things that really interested me through the last election campaign was how divorced the missions stuff was from data. We didn't see a kind of discussion of, okay, if you want to achieve this mission, you're going to need to know these things, or at least, and I appreciate it, I sit on the outside, I just hear people going and talking to politicians through an election campaign going, this happened. But it's, yeah, as somebody who would run a data consultancy workshop, I'd go in there and go, there's no point creating 1,000 APIs. You actually need to know what question you're going to answer and then work down from there. And I think that is perhaps one of the bigger problems with the open data thing of, it's all very well publishing things that you have to statutorily publish, but what is it for? Otherwise, it won't really have users. And I think perhaps I don't think anyone satisfactorily answered the what is the data user need question. It's really hard to work because they're so abstract sometimes. Like who is the beneficiary? If you're writing a user story, who's the beneficiary of a user need in a data space is really hard. And I don't think I've seen it done well or perfectly, or to my satisfaction anyway, anywhere.
I'm going to take a couple of related online questions, both from Anonymous, presumably different ones, but who knows. The first is, why can't open data prove its usefulness to policymakers? And the second is, does open data matter? Was it only just a fad? Do we have any true examples of it working?
I mean, yeah, it works. It did the thing. It was open, it was data. But then the question is, what is it meant to do, right? Like, if you want it to change people's minds, no, because it's quite hard to use an API if you're not already au fait with how to use it. Then it becomes Excel files, then it gets stuck. I think maybe the closest we had was probably in COVID. I think that's the closest moment we had to people using open data sources that were mashed together and turned into something useful that actually drove policy. But even then, they gradually just shrank away as the use for them disappeared. So, and there was the official COVID dashboard, but I think there was that fellow who does all the tech for electromagnetic field camp, and he ran a much better dashboard. Like, it was a nice thing where Sorry, this isn't answering the question, is it? It's not in terminal decline if you don't. But it is a bit of, you must believe in fairies for it to work. You have to. People have to fly the flag for it. People have to turn up and ask for it, and it won't happen unless people are vocally supportive. Otherwise, it will just go closed. It's cheaper and easier for it to be closed.
Thanks. Let's come back in the room. We've got three hands there, so I'll take one, then back, then forward.
Hi, Alex. Fabian Chessel from Policy and Practice. I thought interesting when you said open data doesn't work, as someone who routinely finds their way home using Citymapper and really likes when the transport updates are there. I'm and has been in cities where that data was never opened up. I feel like that's a palpable example. I wonder if sometimes what we see is it works, but not in the way we expect. I was previously a policy advisor in a ministry on this street, and one of the amazing things I didn't realize about open data was that the data was available that would have otherwise just not been published, not been buried, not been found. Policy teams would provide advice, then we've never done a study like that in this country. And then you'd Google ChatGPT and find, yes, actually the Home Office did do something and did publish it in 2010. And actually that turned out to be a better institutional memory, the open publication and cataloguing, than what was set up internally. So I guess you ended that last question with the point, we've got to support it. And it's a complex, difficult thing to support because it doesn't happen in a neat way, it happens in this messy way. So any thoughts on how we can support open data?
I think that the transport one is very interesting because, I don't live in London, and one of the things I find very interesting is that sort of disconnect between being here and being like, oh yes, I could tell you to within 2 meters where the bus is. I go back to Norwich, that is not feasible. I know what time the timetable is, but I do not have a live thing on the bus. I remember some years ago running a thing up in Leeds where what the campaigners really wanted to understand was how, if they had control over bus franchising, how they would route the buses. But the data that they had was utilisation of routes that currently existed. And so I think even when you get into that space of the open data is good at describing the world as it exists, but we have to ask the political questions of what is it that we want to have happen, and where we do not have. I think it goes back to the last talk of how do you mix things together from different spaces to make an argument? But I think that is not a thing that is happening sufficiently.
Let's try and squeeze in 2 quick ones. So row behind and then more again.
Hi, James O'Malley. To what extent do you think the the difficulty with the politics of open data and advocacy, to what extent do you think that is related to the actual politics of like civic tech practitioners and sort of the people in this room, because I'm guessing most of us here are probably left-leaning, I dare say, because it's just a function of demographics of the sort of people who live in cities and work in the public sector and so on. But the people in government making the decisions, the Tories have been in power for a long time. So is there sort of an inherent suspicion there? And a really good example of that, I think, is certainly among this crowd, maybe this is too spicy, I get an impression of, certainly, for example, the people who go to GovCamp, which is a great event, full of brilliant thinkers and everything. But you get a sense of a deep suspicion of AI because of the sort of implicit sort of big tech stuff, which people on the right like. So is it a case that there's a suspicion of open data and people aren't taking it on as a political project because they see it as a sort of the implicit values of people who are different to them? If there's a question there somewhere.
Yeah. Civic tech is protest usually starts off in that way. I have struggled to find right-wing civic tech. The best one is that AI guy in the US who uses it to challenge parking tickets, like the guy who's operating, being sued for being a lawyer without a license or whatever it was. But that's the closest I've found is like an anti-state thing. And honestly, Tom Steinberg told me about that one, so I didn't even find it. Yes, broadly, open data. I remember working with Spend Network 10 years ago on spending data for a council, which very quickly showed corruption. It very quickly showed people using councillors using council money to do things that they absolutely should not be doing because they put it under some interesting spending codes. Who wants that? Which politician's going like, oh no, please find that for me. That would be great. Yes, consultancy fees, go for it. No, it becomes a left-wing project because at the moment the left is in favour of good governance and the right does not stand on that ticket at elections. That shouldn't be the case. Everybody should be in favour of good governance and democracy. It's a sad situation where we are, that is a thing that has become a split.
And because I said I would, I'll take a one-sentence question from Moore and a one-sentence answer from Alex.
Get the hyphens ready.
So, don't you think what we're missing here is power? Because if I'm looking 10 years ago, who are the people who are doing civic tech, and I try to see who are they now, it's not the same demographic. And I'm saying it from a feminist point of view and looking at data feminism. So how do we bring more views and people to actually do civic tech, knowing that they don't have the tool or the privilege today to do it like they had in 2010? Because if I need to say it, like 90% white male English people. Yeah.
More than 90%. Yes. I think it's maybe that we have to find where the power is. Yeah, sorry. That's not one sentence. Yes, that's what we need to do.
That's almost one word. Alex, thank you very much indeed. And just before I invite Tom up as our final speaker, just anonymous online, upvoted more than any other question tonight. No one cares about data. They care about people, objectives, outcomes, etc. Shouldn't we stop talking about data to non-believers? I'll leave that thought linger with you all while I invite to the stage Tom.
Testing, can you hear me okay? Fantastic. Hi, I'm Tom Smith. I'm at the MHCLG, or Mahoka logo. I've spent a long time working data and working digital and AI and so on. And I think I'm really up for that question about what's the value of open data. And I'm really up for questions about what next. But I'm going to talk a little bit first about AI in local government and the work that we're doing in the department to accelerate and support use cases, public services, understanding what citizens are looking for, consulting with them, bringing in a whole bunch of things which are partly technical, but big time about people and so on. And I'm going to start with two things which are probably very familiar to this audience. In January, the DCIT published various things, including the AI Opportunities Action Plan from Matt Clifford, who's now the PM's advisor on AI. Immediately, we published as well part of the response back with foreword from the Prime Minister with that particular quote, which you'll see on pretty much anything that anyone in government talks about in AI. And then this week, Tony Blair Institute, who Laura kind of plugged and talked about earlier, have a very interesting report on reimagining the local government with some interesting examples and some eye-watering numbers. So an annual time saving worth 8 billion across local authorities in England and Wales, equivalent to about 380 million hours, 325 quid per household. That's per year. So these are sort of big numbers, and you can go and look at any report out there and there will be some eye-watering numbers. I think what is interesting, and we'll kind of unpick a little bit, is we're starting to see examples of that in pilots in terms of time saving from actual people just working on their day jobs, trying to improve or speed up what they're doing, trying to improve the kind of the information flow and so on. And we're getting numbers which are stacking up against those sorts of things. Do they extrapolate? Let's find out. But I think we're sort of starting to see some plausible kind of pilots and results. But what does a number like that look like in terms of a real service? So I'm going to illustrate with some of the work that the department's been doing on planning, and particularly digital planning, for a while. So colleagues, this is not in my area, but under a guy called Milan. And there's a sort of series of, again, I find quite shocking statistics from some of the user assessment of why is it so hard to build? What are the planning system blockers and constraints? And a kind of headline around limited use of digital, limited use of AI, limited use of data flows and so on, a high number of paper-based processes, all of that kind of, yes, obvs. But some two really shocking stats here. Half of all planning officer time is spent on manual processing and dealing with errors in applications, so on. This is 2025. The thing that drives building 1.5 million homes in the country and supporting infrastructure development and so on, that's what people are doing on the ground. It's really tough. Lots of other stats in there you can read faster than me, but the other bit I want to pull out is only 7% of citizens trust local planning authorities to make decisions in the best interest of the local community. That's the sort of flip side. It's not just grit in the system and slow, it is actively kind of acting to sort of block the link between public and services. So it's kind of a really, in terms of a single service, a single area, there are some really painful underlying blocks for us. But we know that if we can improve the system, then there are some very big wins indeed. So Office Budgetary Responsibility, as part of the Spring Statement in March, looked at the reforms that the department is bringing around planning, including digital planning, and put up some big numbers there in terms of the value of this in terms of the economy. So something like £6.8 billion into their analysis of what the economy is doing. That's quite significant headroom for state chancellors looking to squeeze money in terms of spring statements and so on, or looking to squeeze out public services in quite a tight environment. So there are some big wins here if we can get some of these systems right. What does it need? It needs a lot of hard work. We just heard about open data. Open data doesn't do anything on its own. You need to look through the processes that people are involved in, do the hard yards around what are each of these areas that people need help and support in terms of plan making, site identification, viability, feasibility assessment. Each of these kind of, you can squeeze out quite significant reductions. Overall, you get back big savings, faster plan making, faster development, faster decisions and so on, but you also reduce costs for industry, for developers, for home buyers, all of the other areas. So you get significant kind of wins back, which OBR kind of pick up as around 6.8 billion. That's a huge improvement. Flicking to sort of AI examples, in this work we've done lots on, and the digital planning team has done lots around consultation work, we've done lots around improving or strengthening assessments and so on, and getting quite significant reductions in terms of time and so on. Not things that will surprise you, but for example, in Plymouth, you looked about 2/3 saving in terms of all time on consultation, public consultations, 33,000 savings, multiplied up across lots of local authorities. These, again, come to quite big numbers. So we have some good examples of what it takes to start shifting the system and start deploying AI and so into lots of those areas. And no surprise, it comes down to things like better data and better reuse. It comes down to supporting and working with councils, local authorities to deploy systems, solutions and so on. It comes down to working with industry and others because government is not going to be doing this all on its own. And those are exactly the sort of messages that came out of the Digital Blueprint for Modern Government, which was published again by DCIT in January. And we've really started to sort of push on how we can work on this with local government as a whole. So this is the kind of second bit and the kind of last minute pitch. So the new AI Directorate, which has now been running for exactly 4 working days, this is quite early, very happy to answer questions we might not know yet, is working up with both colleagues of the department, but also across government, so the Digital Centre, Incubator for AI and so on that Laura mentioned and started, but also working with local councils, with the LGA and others, in terms of how we get this right across supporting to scale, so taking some of the pilot and the seed type work and working to scale this up across all local authorities or big chunks of them. Foundations that include data and data sharing, so working on, for example, like the Mayoral Data Council that we've launched to work with mayors across all of the new devolved areas and the local government teams in the department. Thinking about kind of security, so the local digital programme, which has been running now for, I think, 5 years in the department and local government, looks at cyber support and cyber resilience, so lots of work there. And then finally shaping the markets, so working again with examples of industry providers and services and products that we can help support. And a kind of final example from that, lots of interest in how you improve assessment, casework, take social care. There are a number of government approaches to this, so things like Minute and Consult launched out the Incubator for AI, but there are also obviously industry approaches like Beam, Magic Notes, etc. Working with those to pilot, test, and then help scale up. Those are the sorts of things we want to do more of. Please come and talk to us if that sounds interesting and if there are links across to what you're doing. That's my pitch. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. A reminder, if you want to submit questions via Slido, it's bit.ly/databytes55, all lowercase. I might start with an online question this time. This is from Tom King. When you show people data on a map, do people find it hard to see other dimensions when they're more important and the inevitable data quality problems?
Yeah, everyone loves maps, Tom, as you know. So when I joined this department, it was under Michael Gove and previous government, it was set up as the Spatial Data Unit. And the prime focused target was to improve data on local areas, but also get into the room with ministers and show them big maps of data on maps, because that really grabs people. So yes, maps dominate, but they give you a very immediate sense and link down to place. And if we come back to how you influence policymakers, influence politicians, they have a visceral connection with place, not least through their constituencies. So some way of saying, that's great, that's a headline national figure, here's what it means at local level, here's what it means in your area, is a hugely powerful way of influencing and getting an argument across.
Great, thank you. Let's come into the room for the next question. Any hands going up? We've got one just here.
Hi, David Durant again. This is not directly related to AI, I apologise, but I worked in local government digital for a long time. And while I was there, our options were basically either to buy products from a very small cartel of suppliers or to build our own, both of which is very expensive. A third way potentially to do that is to have things built centrally by MHCLG that can again get used by local authorities across the country. The reasoning always against doing that was because every local authority would say, we're a special snowflake that's different from everybody else. I personally don't believe that's true. The only way to tell whether that is or is not true is for someone to do a large piece of user research to look at user needs across different sorts of council at different scales to show whether or not they really are the same. Is there any sight of that work happening coming out of MHCLG?
And just to add, I've done this to you twice, Dave. You've asked a question, but somebody else online has said something similar. Anonymous says, what is the appetite across councils? Recently worked in local gov. Council didn't want to adopt Copilot as they didn't see any value specifically in casework. I suppose the flip side of Dave's question, really.
Yeah, how long have we got? 5.5 minutes. I could talk. I mean, two things. The first is there's, within MHCLG, but other departments as well, there is quite a strong understanding now of local government from people who've been local government leaders. So we have 2 ministers who ran councils, and they have a visceral kind of connection back to councils. So if you talk to people about cyber, it's like, well, in my council, we were locked out of our computers for a significant period of time, services didn't work. So that kind of link does mean, I think, that the appetite for that, what you asked, is higher now than it was, let's say, X years ago. So first up. Second up is that there are pilots that central government is doing, and others, around trying particular components or particular services or particular products and tools across multiple local authorities. So, as an example, the AI incubator is running with 25 authorities, and LGA and local digital at the department is involved, and piloting Minute as a caseworker assessment tool, basically helping transcription, helping summarise, human in the loop always, but some really interesting results. Now, there are digital industry competitors, as you'd expect, because it's an interesting area. So there's definitely a conversation about what's the role of the centre, what's the role of local, how do you support markets, how do you stimulate innovation, etc. But also, how do you avoid lock-ins, how do you avoid data not being able to move across some services? So yes, kind of, and lots of work still to do. So absolutely yes, and in terms of that kind of follow-up question, I think same answer.
Brilliant, thank you. Not unrelatedly, actually, Lucy Knight, evening Lucy, says, when you say AI, which model types are you specifically hoping to bring to the fore in local government functions, and why? AI covers a lot of things.
Brilliant. Hello, Lucy. We've sort of got captured by AI as a synonym for large language models at the moment, and a lot of the use cases that come up, certainly tonight, around that. In our work, we also are very interested in image analysis. So, for example, Earth observation, satellite imagery, and so on. We are also interested in forecasting, prediction models, with all of the things that Laura said about how hard that is, especially where it's predicting the future rather than what's happening at the moment, like nowcasting. The other bit that I'm really interested in is in terms of digital twins and kind of helping policymakers understand a bit more about which levers have you got to pull that are actually connected to something in the real world that will make a difference. So those are sort of quite complicated areas and different areas, but I would cover all of those. But broadly, AI is like digital plus data plus a bit of methods.
Great, thank you. Let's come back into the room. Got a question at the front.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Chinwe and I work for TfL. I guess the question I have to ask is how, you said something about transparency and safety of the AI. Is there any way that you're quantifying that, and especially with large language models, to train them, information is scraped all across the internet, and the ones that have the largest corpus are usually quite interesting sources. Are you thinking about anything about safety and how to quantify that? And I guess another question that's kind of related to that is that, are you thinking, I don't know the remit or how this is going to be utilised, but are you thinking about like the digital gap that's growing in the country? Because obviously working closely with data and doing in our day job, sometimes it's kind of easy to forget that some people, there's still a very large gap in knowledge and access as well.
Yeah, really good questions. I'll take the second one first, which is about using AI, digital data, etc., to kind of support the digital gap or the inclusion gap. Some of the examples from the pilots of using casework assessment tools, which I found really interesting, were about how it helped people basically who were previously having to do this and say, actually focus on the client, focus on the person, knowing that A, it was recorded, so there's a way that they could kind of try to look back. B, it was going to take reasonably good notes, which they could then test, and C, it would sort of do a summary, which may or may not be quite what they would want to summarise. But it helped them improve their time spent with people in pretty tough situations, basically. So it feels like it's a sort of tool that, these are tools that can help improve the experience and the quality of work from people who currently are running services that are under massive pressure and where it's time, check, 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 check. You know, so absolutely being able to improve that feels like that is something that's very, very relevant to sort of inclusion gaps and digital gaps, etc. I know that's not quite the example of what about people who haven't got access to this stuff at home, but it does give that kind of improvement in terms of the services that they would be experiencing. So that's kind of number one. In terms of the kind of first question around the sort of ethical use, the safe use, etc., it kind of is very much a sort of a technical and a change program and a working through with a service. How are we using this in practice? And I guess the end point is, if you are using it to summarize what your notes are, but you are making the decision and you have your own notes, etc., this is very much human in the loop. So you can look at, are there biases in the sorts of responses or the summaries that were made? Are there biases in the way that the notes were taken? And we can run and assess that. But the overall end point is still your decision. So it feels like there's something there that you can get at and you can test, and you can test in quite a robust way. I'm also really interested in the different models that are arriving. So we go to LLMs, sort of DeepSeek in the Chinese model, trained apparently on a much smaller set of information, much faster, much cheaper. I suspect we will see a huge amount more of those kind of models arriving, which are good enough.
Brilliant. Well, Tom, thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Now, I have a message from Matt on Slido who says, conclave update, no smoke yet. But I'm afraid our data-driven conclave here at DataBytes tonight is sending up the white smoke. We have, unfortunately, come to the end. A few parish notices before I release those of you into the room, in the room to drinks at the back. No judgment of anyone joining us online. You may already be into your drinking. That is absolutely fine. But you will be able to watch all of this back on YouTube or Slido. There'll also be a blog post following shortly from Public Digital with the video, the audio and slides that we're able to share. Please do share that once it's up. The next DataBytes will be on Wednesday, the 4th of June. That will be in Liverpool. Please do come and join us in Liverpool if you can, or join us online if you can't. Again, speaker offers and suggestions, get in touch, events@public.digital. And to finish with a few huge thank yous to PD for hosting, to all of you for coming here in the room and online. Some brilliant questions tonight. Thank you for keeping those flowing. And please do join me in a round of applause for our brilliant speakers this evening. They really have been terrific. Thank you very much indeed.